Hour, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, trying to make a deal. Trade talks between the U.S. and China stretching into a long second day in London with no news yet on an agreement. What Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent just said when leaving those talks moments ago. We'll have a report on the ground and discuss the impact on U.S.-China relations with Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, ranking member of the China Select Committee.
Plus, Senate Republicans preparing to alter or eliminate major provisions of the Trump tax bill. What's being targeted and the next steps when Texas Senator Ted Cruz joins.
And with U.S. Marines nearby, the National Guard on site in Los Angeles, the president blaming outside agitators for the violence.
These are paid insurrectionists or agitators or troublemakers. You can call it whatever you want. And we ended it, and we have in custody some very bad people,
The political backlash over the immigrant crackdown protests and the administration's response as California's governor files an emergency motion to block the military's presence in L.A. Former Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano will speak with us straight ahead.
Now, we begin this evening with a report from on the ground in London, as today's talks between the U.S. and China still haven't wrapped, even if the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has left the building. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern is live outside for us as we speak. So, Annmarie, Bessent has to get back to here in Washington for testimony tomorrow, but Jamieson Greer and Howard Lutnick are sticking around. Does that mean this is going into day 3?
Potentially it's going into day 3. That's what the Treasury Secretary said. He said talks are still ongoing. He left his 2 colleagues, the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Ambassador Jamieson Greer of USTR, to still sit at the table with their Chinese counterparts. He made it clear he's going back because he has testimony in Congress tomorrow in front of the House Ways and Means Committee. Take a listen to what Treasury Secretary Bessent had to say just before he departed Lancaster House.
Evening, everyone. I have to go back to Washington to testify before Congress tomorrow. We have had 2 days of the productive talks. They are ongoing. My colleagues, Secretary Lutnick and Ambassador Greer, are going to be continuing as needed with the Chinese delegation. So thank you very much.
So what we're hearing is that they are really working on some technical details. 2 things really come to mind for me. Going into these talks, NEC Director Kevin Hassett said he thought they were going to be very quick, a quick handshake, and they were going to get to this agreement, which was going to be easing of some export controls on the U.S. side, and then in exchange for getting more access to the rare earths and magnets that China has more than 70% control over that market. What we've seen now is 2 days of more than 13 hours of talks and negotiations, and the fact that the Treasury Secretary actually has to leave because he has prior engagements in Washington, but the talks are still ongoing here in London.
Yeah, Annmarie, we've got a couple days under our belts then, and I know that you've been there for all of it. With that said, did the administration misread the room here? I saw those remarks from Kevin Hassett as well, and it sounds like they've had a lot of time to shake hands.
They've had a lot of time to shake hands, and they certainly did at the start of this. There's been a lot of breaks back and forth. We don't exactly know what the sticking points are. I think one thing is very clear. Kevin Hassett, the NEC director, talked about the fact that they're not willing to go into the NVIDIA H20 chip. So potentially when you look at what export controls they're willing to ease up on, it would be those that came after Geneva. Potentially this is one of the sticking points that is being discussed at the table. We should also mention there is a host of issues that Washington and Beijing have with each other, whether or not it's about how the economies are working, whether or not it's about the trade deficit, whether or not it's about what the U.S. will say it's dumping unfairly on the market, unfair potential practices of buying a lot of Iranian crude, putting their thumb on the scale when it comes to helping the Russian economy. There is a plethora of issues that these 2 countries could get into that are even outside the scope of trade. And we need to remember, during Trump's first administration, the trade war started in 2018 for the Phase 1 trade deal, the purchasing agreement. It didn't end for 18 months. We got a final agreement in 2020. If you look at where we were just 4 weeks ago in Geneva, we are 1 month into trade war 2.0 under Trump.
Really glad you're there for us, Annmarie. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern with us live from London. For more on the implications of those trade talks now, we turn to Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, ranking member on the House China Select Committee. Congressman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. What leverage does the United States have here other than export controls? And if that is the case, and we're to believe that that involves national security, why are we putting national security on the bargaining table?
We shouldn't. We should not relax those export controls. They're incredibly important. Why? Because when we export our highest-end semiconductor chips to the People's Republic of China, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, uses those against our interests and our values. They use them in their highest-end military systems, and they use them to perpetrate human rights abuses, indeed a genocide against the Uyghur people, using their facial recognition models trained using these very chips. We should not relax those export controls. Unfortunately, we're in this situation in part because of the trade chaos that Donald Trump has created, including by imposing blanket tariffs on our friends, partners, and allies. We need those friends, partners, and allies to work with us to put additional pressure on the Chinese, and we don't have them squarely in our corner right now.
Well, Congressman, as you talk about the kind of national security implications around our own export controls, are there not also grave national security concerns if China restricts our access to these critical minerals and rare earths, things we need for things like fighter jets, for example? Isn't there national security risk on both sides?
There is, but again, I come back to working with your friends, partners, and allies to source some of those critical minerals in other places, standing up alternative refining and other manufacturing capabilities elsewhere. That's what you do before you start a trade war and the trade chaos associated with these tariffs that basically end up increasing prices for everybody, allowing the Chinese to feel like they have more leverage, and then hurting our businesses in the process. I'll just give you one anecdote. We have a 25-person small business that just initiated layoffs after it was going gangbusters as late as April. And so that's the leverage in the fact that the Chinese have. They know that it's causing pain for Americans, what the Trump administration is doing right now, and so they're willing to wait it out.
Well, the reality of the situation here, Congressman, is that we're just trying to negotiate our way back a couple of weeks to Geneva, post-Liberation Day. There's a much bigger conversation beyond anything that's in the scope of these talks in London that has to do with reciprocal tariffs and a full-on trade war that we were in a couple of weeks ago. With an August deadline, can we get that done?
I don't know. I don't know what to believe about what Donald Trump says anymore about the state of these talks or where they're at. It seems like he's more interested in headlines than substance. We know that from the first time, I noticed that Annmarie referenced the negotiations from 2018. Remember that phase one trade deal that he negotiated with China? It was not worth the price of the paper it was written on. The Chinese didn't fulfill the agreement then that Donald Trump supposedly negotiated for us. So now I'm concerned that he's not going to be able to deliver an agreement here either.
Congressman, speaking of delivering an agreement or a different kind of deal, the deadline technically is next week for the extended period with which TikTok ByteDance had to divest its U.S. operations of TikTok, obviously due to legislation that you supported and played a major hand in. Would it be a mistake for the president to extend that deadline another time? Should TikTok potentially go dark in the United States next week?
TikTok should not go dark. The administration should help to negotiate a deal for the purchase of TikTok. Unfortunately, because of the trade chaos and this tariff chaos, TikTok has now been a victim of those negotiations. And the Chinese are now basically using that as another item to be negotiated as part of the trade talks. And so, unfortunately, instead of spending time on negotiating this deal with TikTok, they've wasted way too much time with regard to these tariffs. And now another victim of that is potentially national security.
Congressman, President Trump speaking at Fort Bragg as we have this conversation, and he's talking about the operations that are underway right now in Los Angeles, saying that we will use every asset to quell violence in L.A. There's a live view of his speech at Fort Bragg for those of you with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. We've been asking the question, and we've heard it suggested many times over the past 48 hours, Congressman, that this could spread to other cities. What would happen if it were on the streets of New York or maybe on your city of Chicago? Is Chicago and the state of Illinois prepared for a scenario like this? And how would you respond to the president sending troops to your city?
Look, I think that what the president is doing by militarizing the situation is he's provoking further escalation. And that's the opposite of what Americans want right now. They want de-escalation. They want a peaceful resolution to the situation. The other thing that the president is doing is he's basically trying to distract attention from other things that are going on, such as the tariff and trade chaos, as well as the effects of his, what he calls a big, beautiful bill, what I call the large, lousy law, which is about to basically leave 10 million Americans without health insurance. This is what he does not want to talk about or have people focused on. And instead, he's trying to provoke these conflicts, whether it's in California or elsewhere.
But are you concerned, Congressman, that elsewhere may be in Chicago next, to Joe's point? Are you seeing signs of that kind of discord being sown?
I just had a Zoom call this morning with immigration advocates in Chicago, thanks to what Chuy Garcia, my fellow congressman, convened. And they are concerned about what are President Trump's next moves and where they're going to be. I think a lot of people are living in fear today, and that again hurts the economy. Why? Because people aren't going to come to work when they fear a raid on the workplace. They're not necessarily going to go to school. I mean, this has broader implications than just with regard to the targets of these raids. It has implications for our economy, which is already shrinking. We are in a recession.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate your time, as always. Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, thank you so much. Coming up, our conversation with Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, chair of the Senate Commerce Committee. But first, more on the Trump administration's mobilization of 700 Marines to join the thousands of National Guard troops in Los Angeles. We'll discuss the national security implications with Janet Napolitano, former Secretary of Homeland Security during the Obama administration, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We will use every asset at our disposal to quell the violence and restore law and order right away.
President Trump just moments ago at Fort Bragg, addressing troops to mark the Army's 250th anniversary, but of course referencing what is now a fifth day of protests in Los Angeles, where, of course, a total of 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 active duty U.S. Marines have been deployed. National Democrats denouncing the president's military response, arguing it's inflaming tensions.
Constitutional norms and poured gasoline on an already volatile moment.
Joining us now on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, with more perspective on this situation in Los Angeles, Janet Napolitano, the former Secretary of Homeland Security during the Obama administration, former governor of Arizona. It's great to have you back with us, Madam Secretary, on Bloomberg TV and radio. What would you have done if the President of the United States posed this option to you? Not only deploying National Guard troops around the authority of a sitting governor, but in fact deploying active duty U.S. Marines to an American city.
Well, if the president had actually asked me when I was a governor about deploying National Guard or active duty military, I would have first said, let's assess the situation and whether my law enforcement and civilian law enforcement has the capacity and capability to handle this. And in L.A., you've got a very large urban, well-trained police department, and there are 88 other cities in L.A. County, all of whom have police departments that have mutual aid agreements with L.A., and you have the L.A. County Sheriff's Office, which is also a large department. And given what we're seeing on the media in terms of these protests, I would have said to the president, we have no need for militarization of this situation. This is a civil disturbance. There is violence. We will deal with the violence. We will make sure those individuals are arrested. But in terms of the peace and security of our community, we don't need to bring in 4,700 military folks, 4,000 Guard and 700 active duty Marines.
Well, and for those 4,700 service members who have been deployed, what are they actually capable of doing in a situation like this, where if and when the president invokes the Insurrection Act, sure, they might be able to act in a law enforcement capacity, but cannot do so now? What is the real purpose of having them there?
Yeah, it's really kind of mysterious because, you know, LA is a huge geographic city, and there have been pockets of violence which the media focuses on because they're very media appealing in that way. But most of the city is living very peacefully now. Business is going on, people are going to work, kids are going to school. And the order that the president executed was that the Guard could protect federal buildings. And, you know, they're all in one basic area of LA. And so I guess they're going to be standing around. We don't know what the rules of engagement are, and that's a risk. And if this is laying the predicate for invocation of the Insurrection Act, that's a real risk. These are this is militarization of what at base is a civil protest.
Look, we've got a lot of politics going on here. Governor, you know that, and you're no stranger to that business. And there are questions about the way Democrats should be messaging this. Hearing a lot of whataboutism when you ask certain Republicans about this. Earlier today, Republican Congresswoman Lisa McClain of Michigan, who chairs the House Republican caucus, had this response to the protests. Have a listen.
Remember, the Democrats are the ones that demanded that we defund the police. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is what you get when you defund the police. They are the ones who want to abolish ICE. Well, guess what? ICE is the one that protects us.
Janet Napolitano, how do you respond?
Yeah, it's baloney. It's just baloney. It's old tropes that are not the policy nor the position of the Democratic Party. And in fact, the Los Angeles Police Department is a well-funded, well-trained department in a very highly urbanized and very diverse environment. They're used to dealing with these kinds of situations. You know, one of the issues with bringing in the Guard, and particularly with bringing in active duty Marines, is de-escalation, restoring, you know, having a safe and secure environment is not what they're trained to do. And so you have that issue. You have all kinds of operational issues when you just flood the zone with all of these guardsmen and active duty Marines. You know, the communications issues with the folks who are really in charge of safety and security of this area, which is the police department and the sheriff's office. Now, there may be circumstances where it is appropriate to bring in the Guard. During the Rodney King riots in 1992, which were much more widespread, much more serious, much more destructive, the Guard came into Los Angeles at the governor's request. So I look at this as a problem, not only operationally, but a problem of state sovereignty and not adhering to the wishes of the governor. And I also look at it as a problem of proper use of the military on at home in a domestic environment.
Well, obviously, Republicans in the administration are arguing that all of this gets to the root of one domestic issue, which is the border and immigration. And I ask you this as a former governor of a border state, but also someone who used to run the Homeland Security Department. When they say that what we're seeing is evidence that we need more ICE agents, need more Border Patrol and Customs agents, do you see that need as justified? Do we need more personnel in those roles?
Look, I think the border needs to be secure. And actually, I will say many of the things that the Trump administration has done on the border from an operational standpoint have been useful in that regard. But it's a different deal when you talk about interior enforcement within the United States. You know, there are, over time, there have been about 10 million or so undocumented individuals who now live in our country. If the Trump administration is really intent on rooting them all out and sending them all back to their countries of origin, they're going to be in every community. They're going to be in stores and schools and churches and courthouses all over the country, not just Los Angeles. I'm not sure that's what the American people voted for. What they were told during the campaign is that the administration would focus on deporting those who had committed other criminal offenses while they were in the country illegally. But that's not what we're seeing here, nor is it part of the plan for the so-called mass deportation.
Yeah, we've only got a minute left, Governor. Is Arizona ready for this? Is the city of Phoenix ready for a scenario like we're seeing in L.A.?
I would think so. I would think that any governor and any big city mayor right now would be looking at California and looking at what's going on in L.A., saying, you know, that could happen here too, and we better make sure we're ready.
It's good to have you with us. Janet Napolitano, the former Secretary of Homeland Security in the Obama administration, former governor of Arizona. Thank you. Another story we're following this evening, Russia continuing daily attacks on major cities across Ukraine in an effort to pressure Kyiv to accept its demands to end the war. Overnight, Moscow launched 315 drones and 7 missiles at Kyiv and Odessa, targeted urban infrastructure, residential buildings, and a maternity ward, according to Ukrainian officials, civilian targets. One night earlier, more than 700 drones attacked those same areas.
Russia has pledged its increase in production of those inexpensive long-range weapons and hopes to output as many as 500 per day. Today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky released a statement saying, quote, Russian missile and Shahed strikes drown out the efforts of the United States and others around the world to force Russia into peace.
Today, during a House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee meeting, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said this when asked about continued U.S. support for Ukraine.
As you know, this administration takes a very different view of that conflict. We believe a negotiated peaceful settlement is in the best interest of both parties and our nation's interests, especially with all the competing interests around the globe. I don't think the word victory has been well defined or the path to it. And as a result, a path to peace that stops the killing and the carnage is something that President Trump is very invested in.
Also today, NATO said it would consider a proposal that would allow contributions to Ukraine's defense to be included in the new spending target alliance members are expected to adopt, a story that we're continuing to track here on Balance of Power. Coming up, our conversation with Republican Senator Ted Cruz on the Senate's planned changes to President Trump's tax and spend bill. We'll have that conversation next, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The deal breaker is whenever you get out of balance. We struck a very good balance of passing a bill 215 to 214 in the House of Representatives. You have to thread a very narrow needle, and that's what the deal breaker could be, is if the Senate adjusts it too much one way or the other. You could either lose members of the right flank, or you could lose members on the left flank. And so those are things that we're balancing, and that is what could be fatal.
Republican Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri, an important voice in this debate as chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, talking with us on the early edition today of Balance of Power about deal breakers that could come from the Senate modifications to the House tax bill. This afternoon, we spoke with Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas about the Senate's plans for the president's bill, among other issues as well. Started by asking what changes he wants to see in the Senate.
I think the House did a good job starting this process. We're going to get this bill accomplished. We're going to get it passed because it's the main vehicle to deliver on the promises we made to the American people in November. And so it's the main vehicle to deliver the funding to secure the border. It's the main vehicle to rebuild our military. It's the main vehicle to extend the 2017 tax cuts and make them bigger and bolder, and that's critical for economic growth and jobs. The process of the back and forth is ongoing. And so in the Senate right now, each committee is releasing its language, and the Senate is going to take some different approaches than the House did. And ultimately, there will be a conference and the two will come together. And I think through that process, the bill will get better.
Well, and certainly the Commerce Committee has made some changes to the House legislation, including in the bill you released last week, a tweak to the moratorium on state AI laws, tying it to the federal broadband expansion program. Mr. Chairman, are you confident that can get through the Senate? Frankly, has the parliamentarian suggested to you that that will pass muster when it comes to the Byrd rule?
Well, we have yet to argue this before the parliamentarian. I anticipate that we will do so this week, either this week or next week, and it certainly will be challenged. That provision will be challenged in front of the parliamentarian. I don't know how she'll rule. Listen, I think it is very sound policy. If you look at just a few weeks ago, I chaired a hearing on AI, and I think AI is transformational technology that is going to have a massive impact on productivity and jobs across the country. And I think it is critical that America win the race to AI, that we not lose to China. And the hearing I chaired, we had witnesses from across the industry testifying. Everyone agreed there is a real danger of state legislation, and in particular, states like California adopting a heavy-handed nanny state approach, much like the European Union, which would cripple America's leadership in AI. And so I think it is sound policy. Whether it gets enacted on reconciliation or not is a question that's still being argued.
You've got the FAA, of course, in your purview, Senator, and it's an agency that we've all as Americans talked about a lot recently. This is something that touches all of our viewers and listeners. You've got a little over $12 billion here for enhancements and improvements. Is that enough money to replace the nation's air traffic control system?
Well, $12.5 billion is a major investment in modernizing air traffic control. There's no doubt we need to do so. It's something I've been fighting for over a decade in the Senate, that if you look right now at our air traffic control system, it's outdated equipment. They use radars from the 1950s. They use little slips of paper and computers that have floppy disks. My guess is a lot of your viewers don't even remember what floppy disks were, and yet that's what we rely on to keep our flying public safe. That's unacceptable. We need to embrace modern-day technology and GPS. There are enormous upsides, and so $12.5 billion is a major investment. I also think we need reforms to improve the system. That's something that's going to be a real priority for the Commerce Committee.
I'm saving my floppies in case they become collector's items someday. Senator, I wonder if you still feel like Starlink is part of this solution, and if you've had a chance to talk with Elon Musk about it since his apparent breakup with the president.
Oh, look, I think Starlink is amazing technology. And my view is that technology decisions throughout the government ought to be based on the merits. You look at, for example, the BEAD program, which Congress authorized $42 billion to provide connections to high-quality broadband. And in the entire Biden administration, they didn't connect even a single home in America. It was an absolute boondoggle and failure. The President Trump's administration is rightly focused on using that money to actually have connectivity. One of the reasons the Biden administration didn't connect anyone is they decided they hated Elon Musk and hated Starlink, and so we're not going to consider that as an option. And the reality when you're talking about broadband is the right technology depends upon the right location. So in a dense urban environment, fiber makes a lot of sense. If you're out in the mountains or the middle of the wilderness with very sparse population, satellite or less expensive infrastructure solutions make a lot more sense. And so I think the government ought to make those decisions based on the technology that best meets the need.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask you about words we heard from another Senate Chairman, Lindsey Graham of the Budget Committee, who suggested in an interview today that this package may end up needing to be broken up in different parts after all, which, of course, was the original plan of the Majority Leader, John Thune. Is it acceptable to you? Do you think it would be acceptable for the president to not get his entire legislative agenda done in one single beautiful bill?
Listen, I think we're going to get it done. And early on, I advocated for doing it in two bills. I would have been certainly supportive of that. But we're going to get this bill accomplished. And the reason is I think the stakes of failure are too high. If Congress does not act, by December 31st, there's an automatic $4 trillion tax increase. That will hurt every working family in America. That will hurt every small business in America. And that's an outcome that the Democrats are quite happy with, but there's not a single Republican in the House or Senate who wants that to happen. So is it going to be complicated? Yes. Are there a million trade-offs? Yes. But we're going to get it done. And you know, look, I'll reflect back to 2017, the last big tax cut we passed under President Trump. I spent hundreds of hours in 2017 negotiating provisions in that bill. And if you look at how that bill came to pass, the House passed a good bill. It went to the Senate. The Senate made it substantially better. And then we went to conference committee and it got better as well. My hope is the same thing happens this time. I'd like to see the Senate be bigger and bolder. I'd like to see us have more fiscal responsibility and cut unnecessary waste and fraud and abuse. And so that's certainly what I'm urging my colleagues in the Senate to do.
Well, and you'd like to see Trump savings accounts for newborns become a reality. That, of course, was your brainchild, Senator. The law stipulates the baby must be a United States citizen at birth. And I wonder what assumptions you are making about the status of birthright citizenship here.
Well, look, this particular provision doesn't resolve that. It just relies on U.S. law. And so right now, U.S. law confers citizenship on birth. I think birthright citizenship is a policy that doesn't make sense because it encourages illegal immigration. So I've long advocated for changing that policy. But this bill is an economic bill, so it's not purporting to resolve immigration questions. What this bill is doing, and I'm proud to have introduced it and to be fighting for it, it's in the bill, it's going to be enacted. This will create an investment account for every child in America. And newborn children born this year would receive $1,000 to seed that account. And then each year, parents and family and employers would be able to contribute up to $5,000 a year in a tax-advantaged account. That money would grow and it would be invested in the stock market, in the S&P 500. And if you assume, let's assume a little girl, little boy born this year has the $1,000 and then has $5,000 invested each year. If you assume historic rates of growth of the S&P 500, that little baby, by the time he or she turns 18, would have $170,000 in their account. If they kept on investing $5,000 a year, by the time they turn 35, they would have $700,000 in that account. And that's for every child in America. That is a really powerful way to enable every child to have the benefits of compound growth.
Senator, I want to go to L.A. with you for a moment here because I know you're very sensitive to constitutional law, and I'm sure you have very strong feelings about some of the things that we've seen on the streets of America's second largest city over the past 4 days. We received a statement from the chief of police, LAPD Chief Jim McDonnell, responding to the possible deployment of Marines, which now, of course, has happened. We've got 700 deployed from Camp Pendleton. He starts by writing, the LAPD has not received any formal notification the Marines will be arriving. However, their arrival of federal military forces in Los Angeles, absent clear coordination, presents a significant logistical and operational challenge for those of us charged with safeguarding this city. Is what the president is doing right now fair to the police in Los Angeles?
Well, listen, what is not fair to the police in Los Angeles is the actions of Karen Bass, the Democrat mayor, and the actions of Gavin Newsom, the Democrat governor. What we're seeing in L.A. is horrific. We're seeing violent riots that are breaking out and spilling on day after day after day. We're seeing police cars firebombed. We're seeing protesters protesting against the enforcement of federal immigration law. And I got to say, it is a bizarre image to see protesters who say, do not enforce immigration law, we want to be here illegally, to see them waving Mexican flags for the proposition, don't you dare send us back to the country whose flag we're waving. That makes no sense.
Should police have a say in whether troops are deployed, though?
Well, look, the problem we've seen in places like L.A. is the cops, and I think I support law enforcement and the police, but unfortunately today's Democrats do not. When they are given a choice between siding with illegal immigrants or Venezuelan gang members or violent criminals or siding with the police, today's Democrats do what Gavin Newsom does, which is he's suing the Trump administration, saying, do not enforce law and order, do not protect our citizens. I got to say that's backwards. I think we ought to be keeping our cities safe, and that should be, regardless of the circumstances, we should be against violence.
But should we be against states' rights, Senator? Is that not something you stand for? Or does this not risk setting a dangerous precedent of the federal government coming in and overtaking the will of an individual state?
You know what? There's a long tradition when you have local politicians who are lawless, who are defying federal law. The federal government has the authority and has an obligation to enforce federal law. Look, you saw when you had Southern Democrat governors in the civil rights movement resist integrating schools, saying we are not going to allow African-American children in our schools. You saw President Dwight D. Eisenhower send in the National Guard and say you are going to follow federal law and you don't have the right to defy federal law. Well, the new massive resistance Democrats are now fighting against federal immigration law, and the federal government has a responsibility to keep the American people safe. And I got to say, we're seeing a replay of what happened during the Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots, where Democrat politicians prevented the police from protecting their citizens and allowed people to be murdered, allowed stores to be looted, allowed police to be assaulted. And so I'm glad President Trump is stepping forward saying we're going to keep you safe from violence on the streets.
Well, when we consider what he's keeping Americans safe from, Senator, there's a difference between resistance and insurrection. And the president today did not rule out invoking the Insurrection Act. Should he?
Well, look, that'll be a question that will depend on the circumstances. But I got to tell you, the problem is made worse when you have Democrat mayors and governors that refuse to enforce the law. And that's what we're seeing in California. If you break the law, if you commit acts of violence, you should be arrested. And these are lawless protests in support of further lawlessness. Why are they mad? They're mad because President Trump is deporting illegal immigrants. They're mad because he's deporting Venezuelan gang members and murderers and child rapists. And I don't get the Democrats' calculus when they look at that and say, you know what America needs? We need more MS-13 members. We need more human traffickers and criminals. I think the vast majority of Americans don't agree with that.
That was our conversation with Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. And we'll continue our conversation on the ongoing protests in Los Angeles and the Trump administration's response coming up when we assemble our political panel. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we had a flurry of activity today on Capitol Hill as lawmakers debated the president's tax and spend bill and reacted as well to what has been playing out in Los Angeles. President Trump today speaking at Fort Bragg, adding that he will, quote, use every asset to quell the violence, unquote. Joining us now with their reaction to all of this unfolding before our eyes, this evening's political panel. Jim Kessler, Executive Vice President for Policy at Third Way, our Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Brittany Martinez, Executive Director of Principles First. We want to hear from both of you on this. Jim, your reaction to what we're seeing here, Gavin Newsom suing the President of the United States, the President doubling down today, not only rhetorically, but literally adding another 2,000 National Guard troops in Los Angeles. Is this a political battle?
Yes, it is.
Is it more than that?
I think it's first and foremost a political battle, and I do feel like, look, I think Gavin Newsom has brought a knife to a gunfight, to be honest with you. This is what Donald Trump said he was going to do. He's doing it. It feels like Democrats were caught flat-footed here. Violence in Los Angeles, and there's not that much violence there, but such as there is, that is good for Donald Trump. He wants that. He'd like to see violence in more cities. We have a president who wants violence in the cities. That helps him politically. You know, I think Democrats have to be ready in all cities to know what they're going to do to counter that.
Well, Brittany, you obviously have a lot of experience in California. You worked as the California press secretary for former Speaker Kevin McCarthy of the state. What is your reaction to what we've seen borne witness to over the last 5 days?
Well, first and foremost, I mean, Americans have the First Amendment right to freedom of speech. What they don't have the right to do is riot and loot the way that they've been doing. And anyone who's been violent should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But with that being said, what we haven't seen many times in our history is the United States president going and sending the National Guard into a state where the governor hasn't requested those resources.
So you see Newsom as having a good standing here as he sues the administration.
Well, what we've seen is from folks on the ground is that they said that they had it under control. And I'm not there. I can't say it from my own eyes. But we have a president who is a conservative, a Republican, who believes in limited government. That's traditionally what Republicans have believed in. And he's using his executive authority to go into a state where they said, we're good to go. Like, we don't need you yet. There were law enforcement officers who also parroted the same thing. And so it's concerning. And I think to all the people who are chaos agents and are being destructive, you're taking away from the message that is, this is a concern. We should be paying attention. And to the executive order that the president signed, it didn't even mention California. So to your point about Democrat governors preparing, I don't think you're wrong there.
Well, so let's get into this a little bit more from the Democratic point of view, because the narrative now is that Democrats are so busy making commercials and bumper stickers. You've already won the midterms based on the optics that we're seeing in Los Angeles. And I think you're looking at this with a little bit more nuance. What if this does start to spread to other cities in blue states?
Well, I expect it's going to spread. I mean, Donald Trump has just thrown gasoline on the fire in Los Angeles. This is good for him. This is what he wants. And I imagine it's going to spread to other places. I also want to be clear that the people who are standing on burnt-out cars holding up Mexican flags, they're not Democrats either. They're not going to listen to what Democrats say is good for them for the midterms. I do think that Democratic governors and mayors need to be ready so that when there's some chaos there, they are showing they have got it under control completely. Maybe there's some curfews that they put in there so that Donald Trump does not have an excuse to douse the flames with gasoline.
Well, Donald Trump, of course, has said that this is really why he was elected president, that the country wanted him to focus on these issues of crime and immigration. Does that, though, as we see the military literally going into U.S. cities, Brittany, risk backfiring on him? Is this really, in your mind, what people voted for?
When we talk about immigration, I mean, you're right. People want us to have a stronger stance on immigration. I do think that for a long time, our generosity has been abused. But with that being said, the way in which it's done matters to the American voters. And I think that when we see polling after this next week or so, I think we're going to see a difference, because what we saw is just these ICE raids, especially in a place like California. I'm from California. I grew up there. I had friends whose, sadly, his parents were undocumented and were deported in high school when there were 2 kids and both parents got deported, right? And so it's families, it's these stories. It's not just another number and another figure to be looking at. And the last thing I'll say is that this weekend, when it is the president's parade, or I'm sorry, the military parade, the president's parade, is that he's already let out a message saying any protesters are going to be dealt with full force. And that's the president of the United States. We have the right to assembly, to peaceful protests. And you're already making the assumptions that this is going to turn into something violent. Him signaling that means to me that he's trying to cause a fight.
We've got a minute left. Jim, how worried are you about this big military parade on the president's birthday on Saturday? The optics, the vision that we just heard could be difficult here.
I expect there's going to be some performance artistry going on both sides here. But I do want to say on what's happening with the president and on immigration, this is what people did vote for. I am not surprised in the least of what is happening and that he's deploying troops. He said this over and over and over again. So he's doing what he promised to do. I'm not sure it's going to be popular, but this is what he promised to do.
Promises made, promises kept, perhaps. Jim Kessler and Brittany Martinez, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much. And we actually are live in California as we end this program, this time at the Bloomberg Global Credit Forum, taking place in Los Angeles with questions around these protests, trade wars, inflation, growing concern of a slowdown in the world's largest economy looming large. Bloomberg's Lisa Abramowicz is joining us live on the ground with some of the information on her interviews and the protests we've been covering, how they've impacted the event. Lisa, what a time to be in Los Angeles.
Yeah, Kaylee, although as you can see from my backdrop, it doesn't exactly look like what you're seeing in downtown LA. And frankly, it seems like, yes, while some meetings have gotten canceled, it is a very small part of the city. And the city is a very big, sprawling city, as many people know. I am here right now ahead of tomorrow's conference at the Fortress Investment Group's real estate conference. I was just catching up with the co-heads of the real estate group, as well as the co-CEO, Josh Pack, as well as Tim Sloan, who used to be the CEO of Wells Fargo. They were talking about how this hasn't really affected their investment strategies and how they've taken a lot of the policy changes in stride, but they do still see this huge disintermediation underway with a lot of business that has been at the banks heading into private investment firms, even with the deregulation that we've seen from Washington, D.C. Take a listen.
There's significant demand for investment here in the U.S. There's a large trend towards kind of private credit taking market share away from the commercial banking system. And we've seen that in a number of different products, whether that's real estate, private credit, forward flows, consumer finance. And it's we think it's a terrific opportunity. We think it's kind of a long-lived opportunity and one that we're going to be investing in for, a significant period of time. And at the same time, we're seeing lots of opportunity in Europe. We're seeing, great continuation of investing of our Japan franchise. So, we're pretty active all over the world now.
Yeah.
Lisa, at the end of the day, investors go to where they're going to get the best returns. And there are still incredible opportunities here in the U.S., but also in the other markets that Lisa mentioned, or that Josh mentioned.
When you talk about the United States, you're talking residential, you're talking commercial. Is there, within the residential market, more room for some of these private asset managers at a time where there's an increasingly stagnant market in some ways because of mortgage rates?
Oh, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the residential market.
Like what?
For example, we're one of the largest purchasers of tax liens in the U.S. And those are very, very attractive risk-adjusted returns. You're generally buying those at about a 10% yield for being less than 1% loan to value.
Joshua Pack, the Fortress co-CEO, talking with Bloomberg's Lisa Abramowicz. We thank you, Lisa, for the update. Fortress Vice Chair Tim Sloan, part of that conversation as well. You can read a lot more in the Washington Edition newsletter on all the stories we covered today. You can find it on the terminal and online.
And of course, you can find us right back here tomorrow as we'll have the latest from Los Angeles, the latest on budget reconciliation, and potentially the latest on U.S.-China trade talks, which are still ongoing in London. So we'll see you then right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.